Welcome to the Higher Self Habits podcast, where astrology meets behavioral psychology. Join me, your host, Angela Xavier, and together let's dive into all things astrology, how to align your mindset with your birth chart, and so much more. My intention with this podcast is to inspire you with strategies, tools, and teachings that you need to consistently get after your goals with flow and ease. Your higher self is already doing so. And after all, you are what you repeatedly do. I am so happy to have you here with me, so thank you so much for being here. Now let's begin. Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Self Habits podcast. So happy to have you join me today. In this episode, I'm coming at you with another astrology school episode. I'm going to keep it direct and to the point as much as possible, so it can be as applicable as possible for you to implement in your astrology studying journey. In this episode, we're going to learn the basics of how to read a birth chart. My intention with this episode is for you to have a greater understanding of your chart as a whole, to see the whole picture, the whole story of who you are, beyond just the introduction level, beyond the information that's just your sun sign. So in saying that, this episode will be explaining the components of the chart. I'm going to get into some theory, some philosophy on why those components are so important, and the steps on how to interpret it. So how to plug it all in together and see your chart as a whole story. So in saying that, I won't be diving into any specific placements today. Before we dive in, I want to refresh this perspective about astrology. That astrology is not something to believe in, right? Like this thing that immediately throws off unwoke people. This woo-woo vibe of something. Astrology can simply be seen as a tool to expand your perspective about yourself and to think of it more as a lens for exploring behavior patterns, because after all, that's truly all it is. So if you think about it, astrology is simply data that has been collected for thousands of years on how people behave. And this data was then compared to where the planets were at that time. Now, because it's so intricate, so detailed, it has this whole other persona, this whole other art and science to it, when really it's simply just the same as people, being depressed in northern parts of the world during the winter, or when people have this inkling to clean and purge their homes in the spring, right? We behave in ways that are a result of the energy that we experience here on Earth. We're simply just floating on a rock, and whether we consciously interpret what is happening to us or not, we are still behaving as a consequence, right, of being here on Earth. And astrology, then, it gives us this opportunity to understand energy and therefore strategize with it, which is my favorite thing to do, to live a better and more fulfilling life. And after all, that is what astrology is. It's just a study of life. And that's my favorite way to understand what I am reading when I look at a chart. To read astrology is to read the language of life. Think of the components, being the signs, planets, and houses in astrology, as the words of this language. The placements, so where these components connect, are then the sentences of this language. And the chart as a whole can be read as the story. You have to first learn what the words mean to understand what the sentence is saying, right? If you think of this simply in any language you're learning. All right, so now let's dive in. First, if you can, pull up your birth chart. If you're unable to, don't fret about it. You'll still get a lot out of this episode without having it in front of you, but it is easier to understand with the visual cue in front of you. If you've never done this before, if you've never pulled up a chart before, you can do so very easily online. I have a free link in my Instagram bio, or just go ahead and go to www.astro-charts.com. This website is free and super easy to use. You'll have to know your exact birth time, however, to pull up your chart when you enter your data. Okay, so you got your study hat on. Are you ready to dive in? Really go in now? So as you begin to read a birth chart, keep in mind this perspective of reading this ancient study of behavior patterns, okay? Of reading this language of life. And when you look at a chart, the primary focus for you is these three components: the planets, the signs, and the houses. And now, as astrology is this language of life, when interpreting the planets, you're reading the experiences of life. When interpreting the signs, you're reading the characteristics of life. When interpreting the houses, you're reading the areas of life. In other words, framing it all together in a sentence, when you have a life experience, that's represented by the planet. How you behave in that experience is represented by the sign the planet is in. And where in your life this experience is most prevalent is represented by the house the planet is in. Can you see that layering process begin to unfold as something to read? So reading this layering, the planet, the sign, and the house, is also called interpreting the placement. And the placement, in a sense, is the blend of all three to interpret what that fusion of the sign, planet, and house is telling you. And yes, an integral component to reading a birth chart is understanding all the craziness you tend to see going on in the colored lines in the center, right? These are called aspects. And these aspects explain the relationship between the placements for a more detailed understanding of a chart, as well as more insight on how to activate the placement, what obstacles you may experience often around this placement, or what is in your favor and perhaps comes really easy to you and may behave lazy around this experience, right? It paints more of a picture. So for basics, just get these three components down, and from there, dive into how those components relate to each other by looking at the aspects. So with this basic knowledge of how to read a chart, my best advice for you next is to learn what the planet, sign, and house you're zoning in on represents on its own before you begin to interpret its placement. So learn the roots of the sun and everything that it represents. Learn the sign, just its genuine, pure energy without the connotation of it being a sun sign, right? Learn what it is at its root before you begin overlapping it. This will allow you to piece together the whole chart more seamlessly and be able to make more sense of the aspects and so much more. Now, there are more episodes coming your way where I will be explaining in full detail all of the components. So if you look back to my previous episode about the sun, how it explains just like the genuine energy of the sun, you will have more episodes in the future that go into all of the planets, signs, and all those things. Let's continue down the path of observing the planets. So the planets in a birth chart are the only key component of the three that aren't fixed. They're all like dancing around, doing their own thing in the chart, right? Which is why charts can look so different from each other, because the planets are always moving and they always have a different placement at a given time of birth. Like how the moon can be in a different sign just as quickly as you see its phases change. And this movement of the planets is always in progress. To get a better sense of that, when you're looking at your birth chart, you're looking at a snapshot of the sky at the exact time of your birth. So in the center of your chart is where you were when you were born, meaning where the planets are in your chart, all floating around doing their dancey thing. That is how you saw those planets from your vantage point on Earth. And why I feel it's important to explain that when you're learning how to read a birth chart is because a solar system has the sun in the center, right? But when you look at a birth chart, the sun is in the chart. So it can kind of throw you off, and I feel that adds more complexity than there needs to be. So think of your birth chart as you in the center. and the sun being the relation of where you were at the time of your birth, what constellation it was in front of, right? It's also too important to keep in mind that the planets all have different sizes of orbits. For example, Mercury has the shortest orbit, the smallest orbit, as it is closest to the sun. And therefore, you will most likely have your sun and Mercury in the same sign. Now, I understand there is a lot to comprehend and perhaps isn't relevant really for diving in. I just find that fascinating, and I saw the chart from a whole new perspective when I really locked down that factor. And because all the planets have different orbits, it increases this uniqueness of your chart and decreases the probability of someone having the same chart as you. This is a really cool fact I read in, honestly, the Astrology Bible for me that started this whole life calling to get into astrology in the first place. And it was a line from astrologer Joanna Woolfolk's book saying that unless someone born at the same time in the exact place as you, chances are someone having an identical chart won't occur for approximately 4 million years. Like, that just blows my mind when you really think about how diverse we are. And it really just validates how unique we truly are from each other. And again, this type of empowerment all comes from this perspective, right? Perspective is a huge theme to keep in mind when you're learning astrology, especially the perspective of those who first created it. So let's go back in time a little bit now. In ancient times, before the main religions we know today, the ancient Greeks and Romans believed in many gods. And these gods, for example, Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, had her own temple where people would go to worship her, to bring in more elements of love and beauty in her life by being a servant to worshiping her. They genuinely believed that it was thanks to these gods that we as humans were able to experience these things. We're able to have love and beauty in our life and all of the other things that each god represented through that worship. So you would worship Saturn for more prosperity. You would worship Jupiter for more abundance, etc. Which is why the planets were named after them. The experience of when something in life occurred was because that god was doing it, right? They were causing that experience. So today, now applicably using this, we see how the planets are then interpreted as the experience that coincides with the god that the planet is named after. So this is just another tool for you to then examine your behavior based off of the thousands of years, again, of behavior data around this planet. And the ancient perspective of the signs also played a huge role in how our ancestors interpreted life as well. First recorded by the ancient Babylonians was our 12-month calendar. It was a pattern that was noticed in the sky when specific star constellations would return after every 12 moon cycles. It would stick around for about 30 days at a time. And this is where the zodiac signs come from. Each constellation told a story. And in these stories were, of course, the main characters. These characters all have certain characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, and lessons to learn. I just imagine like our ancestors sitting around a fire staring up at the sky in, say, Virgo season, and the Virgin is just bright and shining. Elders are telling the story of how important, right, the Virgin is, the goddess, the grain goddess, her importance of harvest, and all of the characteristics, the traits that this goddess foretold in her experience, in her message. And it is in those characteristics that Virgo came from. And now the third component that we have is the houses, which I find can be the most challenging for people to get a good grasp of, but don't fear, just focus on the basics today. Because after all, remember, astrology is a language. And just like learning any language, you can't expect to be fluent right away, right? The houses are the skeletal structure of a chart. So taking a look in the center of your chart, you can see the numbers 1 to 12, and this is showing you the spread from the first house to the 12th house. Now I will create future episode where we'll dive into all 12 of the houses, what they each represent, and so much more. So for today, I just want to explain the houses, the overarching importance for a reading birth chart they have. And the biggest takeaway for you with the houses is that they're the areas of life, the where in your life these experiences of the placements are occurring. Looking at more of an example of this, okay? In this experience that you're looking at with this placement, is it occurring in the house of your relationships? Is this experience in your area of life to do with money and your finances, or your home and your family life? Because once you understand how having certain experiences is highlighted in certain areas of your life, you have a huge advantage to understand how you best operate. For example, if you have the reserved and calculative Scorpio in your 4th house of home and family life, you're just not going to feel aligned with venting about your family drama with people who don't have that inclining to be more reserved, right? You won't want to vent naturally compared to people who do feel that need, who feel aligned to get it off their chest, like a Gemini would, to communicate what's going on in their family drama. Also 10 points if you also apply the placements that are an aspect to what you're reading and seeing an even grander and more intricate perspective on it all. Can you see now how you can begin reading your chart as a story? You can begin to decipher strengths, weaknesses, obstacles, talents, and specific experiences that, when intentionally activated, now knowing this about yourself, can bring about transformations, growths, level ups, glow ups, ease, flow, all of the juicy things that feed into creating your dream life. And honestly, the best part about reading a birth chart is it's so much fun. It's so much fun to learn about yourself, to put reasoning and permission behind why you do what you do. It's extremely empowering. And there is truly no better feeling than to learn about yourself and fall in love with what you learn. And honestly, when it comes to manifestation, that is the true juice, the true root of how to make it happen so impactfully for you, so much faster, is when you release all the tension and pressure by loving yourself. Like, I know how hunky-dory comes to mind. I've never used that phrase. I don't know where that came from. But like, I know how, kumbaya that sounds. But when you truly love yourself and learn why you love yourself, things you desire come faster to you. Speaking from experience here. And reading your birth chart is to learn a new perspective about how you behave when experiences occur in certain areas of your life. Plain and simple. But the study far exceeds this how, what, and when, right? The power of reading a birth chart is when you begin asking the why. So you have the how, you have the what, and the when. Your free will is to ask why. Taking what you've learned from this story you're reading and rewriting the one that you want by living on purpose. Your birth chart, is both the description as well as the guide to your higher self. So reading the how, what, and when is the description. Asking why is to apply the strengths, everything you know about yourself, into the process as a direction, as a manual for you to embody. I'm so excited for you to dive in with this new perspective, and I cannot wait to get even deeper with you and really dig into the nitty-gritty of a chart. That is all for this episode. And if you do like this episode, if you do like these astrology school deep dives, please let me know. Please leave a review. It really greatly benefits my channel, as well as what I can bring to you in the future, knowing if it is of interest. And yeah, with that, I hope you have a lovely day, and I will catch you in the next episode. Bye.